Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mindfulness Monday, September 14th. For those of you who have listened to my previous Mindfulness Mondays, know that I've talked about how challenging this time is right now. We're still navigating this global pandemic. We're dealing with unresolved issues around the Black Lives Matter movement. Devastating fires are raging here in California, Washington State, and Oregon. And we have a primary election just around the corner. I'd say we have an awful lot to think about right now. Our plates are full. I've also said that this is a very ripe time to go deeper within ourselves and do some serious soul searching. I think of this time, and you've heard me say this if you've listened to my previous Mindfulness Mondays, that this is a time of personal transformation. It's a ripe time to take the opportunity to go within and look at things just a little bit more deeply than perhaps we're used to when we're very busy and distracted in our lives. And when great changes can happen, both personally and collectively, that's when we really can see the changes not only happen in our own lives, but out in the world. We do have a lot of changes that we know needs to happen. And it's time for us to look at what isn't working anymore. And clearly, based on what we're seeing right now, there is a lot wrong with not only the well-being of our environment and the future of our planet, but how we are coexisting with one another. Today, I want to talk about something that can help shed light on how we behave towards others, and it's called subtle acts of exclusion, which brings me to my special guest today, Michael Baran. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Michael Baran is a social scientist, senior partner, and digital solutions lead at inQUEST Consulting. He has taught at Harvard University and worked as a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research. He is the co-author, along with Tiffany Jana, of a new wonderful book called Subtle Acts of Exclusion: How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions, which offers a pathway to a more inclusive, respectful society. Hello, Michael. Welcome to Mindfulness Monday.
Hi, Ora. Thank you. Really happy to be here with you.
Yes, your book is so thought-provoking, and there's so much that I want to cover with you today. So why don't I start with the title of your book, Subtle Acts of Exclusion, and why you and Tiffany felt it was necessary to propose, if you will, a new term for microaggression, even though, from what I could tell, it means pretty much the same thing. Explain to our listeners why you believe the term SAE, the acronym of that, or subtle acts of exclusion, is much more useful.
Yeah, so let me set the foundation for folks who haven't even heard of that term, microaggressions, before. So these are times when people might, they're not necessarily trying to do harm. They might be trying to bond with you, to ask a question, to tell a joke, to even compliment you. And yet the impact that those words or actions have on the other person is very different. It creates pain, exclusion, maybe even reinforcing systems of exclusion for people of marginalized identities. And so since the 1970s, people have been calling those microaggressions. What I was finding is I would be doing workshops with groups, and someone would bring up a very common microaggression, something like, calling a Black man articulate or something.
Right, which I saw in your book. You shared that experience, which was really eye-opening. Maybe you want to tell them about that more in detail.
Yeah, so this is a very common example, calling, especially a Black person articulate or well-spoken or professional. And so on the surface, it sounds like a compliment, but what's being communicated implicitly is more like, people like you are inadequate, so I'm surprised that I'm pleasantly surprised, right? And so it's not making that person feel complimented, it's making them feel excluded, right? And so what I'd find in workshops is I'd bring that example up, and people would have 3 different reactions. First, people would get very defensive. I wasn't trying to be aggressive at all. How can you say that? You can't call that a microaggression if you don't know what I was thinking, right? The term itself was focusing everyone's attention on the speaker's intention, which is exactly the opposite of where we want to be. We want to be focusing on the impact it had on the other person. So that wasn't helpful. Then people who are experiencing this consistently are thinking and expressing, well, these don't feel micro to me. They feel like a huge deal. And they are a huge deal. Like, they're making people feel not satisfied in their jobs. They're even causing mental and physical health problems because they happen so consistently. So that's not productive. And then everyone is sort of thinking and expressing, well, if these are just a micro, small problem, why are we spending that much time talking about them? And that wasn't helpful. So I'd sort of mutter under my breath for a few years, or maybe a year, like, someone's got to think of a new term for this, or someone's got to think of an alternative way of talking about this, because this is getting in my way. This is getting in the way of us connecting, building inclusion, building trust, having good conversations. And so started talking with Tiffany, who I had known for a long time. Tiffany was finding a similar thing. And we said, well, hey, might as well be us. Let's do this. So I had a brainstorming list of potential reframes that I'd been working on. Tiffany and I got together and we decided to call them just what they are: subtle acts of exclusion. They're subtle, right? There are some, it doesn't mean it feels subtle when it's happening to you. It very well might not, right? But it means that some of these, they're not quite hitting that threshold of, well, I know I need to say something about this. I know I need to report this. I know I need to speak up about this. I can tell why this is a problem. They're much more insidious. So we need some guidance there. Then they're just acts. They're not intentions. They're things that people said or did. And we can talk about that without people getting defensive. And finally, we thought, let's just name the problem right in the term itself. They create and perpetuate exclusion, the opposite of inclusion. So then our publisher said, well, if you're going to try to reframe this concept, that's got to be the title of the book. So there you are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously something like microaggression just sounds aggressive. Just that word itself sounds like it is intended to be so. And what I really like about subtle, just even using the word subtle, which I think is really much more helpful for someone who's doing something and then perhaps their intention is not with a malintention, if you will, that they're on sometimes such subtle levels, so that when someone says to you, that was actually offensive, and you could be so surprised and say, wow, I had no idea, whereas sometimes maybe the intention was. But as a mindfulness practitioner, for me, it's really a more mindful way to look at something so that people can have a more heightened awareness of their choice of words, even if it's in a complimentary context. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes the intention is absolutely aggressive, right? I mean, if there's a whole range of aggression, of hurt, of violence, of pain that happens to people. Some of it is very explicit, not subtle at all. Some of it is very intentional, not good intentions at all. Some of it is very aggressive, right? What we're doing is taking of that whole range, taking a slice of it, which is really a complicated part of all that. That often goes unaddressed. And we're trying to bring attention to that part and not trying to sugarcoat it and say, oh, none of this is aggressive. None of this is intentional.
Of course.
So I love how you brought that up.
Yeah, I mean, it's relative to how, someone can have a conscious awareness of asking a question or giving a compliment that on the surface sounds very innocuous, but it still can be offensive to somebody.
Yeah.
So, even that question or even that comment in a complimentary context, like, that was so articulate of you. I know that I wouldn't say that to a friend. I would probably be more inclined to say, that's a really good point. I'm so glad you brought that up. Do you know what I
Right.
mean? And
Right.
this is really very illuminating, because what that does is it starts to, again, heighten your awareness of the choice of words that you're using, taking that momentary pause, if you will, which mindfulness helps us do. We
Yeah.
take that momentary pause before those words leave our lips, and so I think with subtle acts of exclusion, it's such a great way as a starting point to say, let me really think about how I want to say this or how I want to frame this to this person. So I think you presented something that is really very illuminating and very helpful for people.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's certainly the intention, that if we want to have good conversations and get somewhere and build trust and help it so that people are included and not excluded, we need to be mindful in those ways. We need to. So in the book, we have very specific guidelines for how to go about conversations like that, because they do require more mindfulness than just calling someone out on, Facebook or Twitter. That feels good, but it's probably not going to get you anywhere. And so if that relationship is important to you, you need to be more mindful of how you approach that conversation if you're the person that wants to say something.
Right.
And even more importantly, if you're the person getting that feedback, how are you going to do that in a way that's not defensive, that really validates what that person's saying, that really hears what that person is
Absolutely.
saying, and
Exactly.
then really takes it seriously and follows up and follows through.
Exactly. It's really timely, Michael, I feel, because of the way in which people are talking to each other. I often bring up, where is the art of discourse or civil discourse, the way in which we're talking to one another, that we aren't having this mindful awareness of how much we are actually hurting and offending one another. So I think it's really timely. Let's talk a little bit about how you and Tiffany, who have different identities, privileges, I'm paraphrasing from your book, and
Yeah.
educational experiences,
Yeah.
arrived at a similar professional place with a common vision for you to collaborate. I'm talking to you today and Tiffany isn't with us. Tell us more about why the subject of subtle acts of exclusion resonated for you, with based on who you are.
Yeah, I love that. I'll talk about both of us. So for me, my training is, I got a doctorate in cultural anthropology. When I started getting fascinated by how all these different issues related to unequal treatment and disparities and exclusion, when my eyes started getting really open to that, and I got passionate about doing something about it for my career, I dove into cultural anthropology, which resonated so much for me as a way to really understand perspectives of other people, and to really hear other people's perspectives, and to really understand the subtle ways that cultures serve to include people or exclude people, to value some people and not others. And so I just dove into studying that and figuring it out, with the idea being that once I figured it out, I could start to work with organizations on what they were doing, once I understood it better for myself. So that's how I got really into this, looking at the intricacies of culture, of communication, even of framing concepts, right? How the concept is framed, and how that really kind of determines how people understand what it is and think that they could do something about it. So like how we frame microaggressions or reframe it as subtle acts of exclusion. Now, like you mentioned, I'm white, I'm male, I'm cisgendered, I'm heterosexual. Along those dimensions of diversity, I'm not experiencing subtle acts of exclusion on a daily basis, right? And it's that deep passion, listening skills, observation, and understanding of culture that helps me kind of do research and figure out what people are experiencing and want to do something about it. Now, Tiffany, on the other hand, is Black, presents as female, but identifies as gender non-binary, LGBTQ. So their experiences are very different than mine in life, right? And so they bring all of that to our discussions, which is absolutely critical. And we both work in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, working with organizations and with people and their efforts to be more inclusive, to be more fair, to build more equity into organizations. So we both kind of converge along those lines, even though our identities are very different and our experiences with subtle acts of exclusion are very different. We converge in the way that we approach the work, which is really, Tiffany also is a doctor, Dr. Tiffany Jenna. So we approach the work with that same reliance on evidence, on evidence-based practices, best practices, on bringing people in to the work and communicating in a way where we kind of talk to people, even in our writing, like we talk, because our goal is to not exclude people through fancy jargon, but rather to bring everyone on board. So there's so much that we align on in the way that we approach the work. And that's how we started getting to know one another. And so we have all the diversity of our perspectives and then all the similarities in the way that we approach the book and the work, that writing it together actually was pretty seamless. We brought our differences to the work and our collaboration was just fantastic and in many ways easy. We didn't have any struggle, like how do we incorporate your voice and my voice, because we just have so much alignment on how we approached it.
Well, the book is very seamless, being that you co-authored it, and it gives a very fair perspective from both of your, experiences. So I thought that was really good. Let's talk a little bit about, how do we take the subtle acts of exclusion concept, if you will, plug it into right now with what's going on with the recent protests around the Black Lives Matter movement after the brutal murder of George Floyd, where emotions are really high right now. And the whole notion of inclusive exclusivity is really very much a hot topic. So you're really kind of almost taking an idea and wanting to bring it into an environment that is in some ways behaving very antithetical to that concept that you're proposing. Do you know what I mean? You've got a really very high level of emotionality going on. So how do you introduce that into this moment in time, if you will?
Yeah, I don't see it as so antithetical, because what I'm finding more than anything else, what we're finding is, yes, you have people who are very vocal in a minority who are kind of opposed to, talking about Black Lives Matter, talking about systemic inequalities, thinking, well, why are we still talking about this? Things like that. There's a very small vocal minority that has that opinion. But more than that, we're finding that the vast majority of folks want to do something about this, want to understand it better, want to have authentic relationships across difference, want to have real conversations, want to figure out how to be better allies. If we're talking about white people, how to be better allies for Black colleagues and Black coworkers and friends and family members. And so we're actually finding a hunger for how do you do it then? I want to do it. How do you do it?
But how do you do it without tripping over your own words right now? Because there's a lot of sensitivity, there's a lot of emotionality around what's been brought to the foreground, necessarily so, around systemic racism. So you have people that feel very comfortable with that. Some people feel they have to tiptoe. They have to, be overly sensitive. So they're trying to find that sort of comfort level, if you will.
Yes. And what we really try to communicate to people is don't worry about getting everything perfect. You're going to make mistakes, right? And that's okay. That's normal, right? I always tell this great story about one of my younger children who was in preschool, And every day at this preschool, they would repeat their values as a class of 3-year-olds. And one of the values was we make mistakes. And that's so powerful, because then if you incorporate that as part of your identity and your value, you can push yourself to learn challenging things and not be so afraid to get things wrong. You can really do that in a way that grows your mind and challenges you and doesn't make you feel bad and doesn't make you hesitant. And we kind of want people to have that same spirit with this. If we're really trying to grapple with and address hundreds of years of violence, inequity, exclusions, it's gonna take some work. It is not gonna be like,
This is
oh,
not an overnight thing.
no,
Yeah.
or an easy thing to figure out.
Huh.
It's hard, and you're not gonna get it perfect. These things are gonna happen. We expect them to happen, and we commit to fumbling through it, stumbling through it together, because it's that important. And so that's the key for us. The goal is not a kind of culture where we're scared to say anything and walking on eggshells. It's the opposite. It's a culture where we build trust and we build authenticity, and where we can speak up about things when they happen and then address them and move forward past it, where people aren't harboring resentment because they can't say anything, where people, that's what we're working towards.
Yes, absolutely. And I think if anything, it is important to know that these are sensitive issues that maybe for a very long time people have not even understood perhaps their own feelings around it. And it's part of the conversation now. We can't escape it. It's on the table. Do you know? So I think that finally, absolutely, it's like you
Right.
really get that the needle really can seriously move. Do you know? And so the idea of that, yeah, we really, when we throw out that term right now, this isn't at all just about the pandemic. We are all in this together. Do you know? I think that really is a wonderful phrase for the fact that let's be in this together. Let's really work with each other or teach one another maybe what our ignorance has been about, or our unknowingness, if you will, towards the fact that we may have subtle acts of exclusion that we didn't even know that we were perpetrating. Do you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know you said in your book that it is the current climate, which is hard, you and Tiffany both say, to talk about sensitive issues. It can be problematic. I think it can be problematic if we don't talk about it.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's, the current climate for people of marginalized identities has been hard. It's hard and has been hard forever, right? Like these murders, for example, that's not new. That's been happening. So what's new, hopefully, like you're saying, is people's awareness and willingness to learn, talk about some of these things. Hopefully that's new, right? I mean, we'll see if it's real commitment, if it's here to stay, if we're able to really move the needle.
Yeah.
We'll see. I run into so many people who are not that hopeful that we're going to make a huge difference right now, and who are frustrated and exhausted and fatigued with trying to say this stuff for so long and trying to get people on board for so long, even trying to say things as simple as speaking up about a subtle act of exclusion, and only being met with defensiveness and resistance, when it seems like you could just say, oh, okay, I won't call you articulate anymore. Like, it seems like your first reaction could just be like, oh, okay.
Absolutely. I mean, even when I read that story, what came to mind for me, and I consider myself, a pretty inclusive person. However, there's always much to learn. I love that Zen Buddhist book, Beginner's Mind. We must come to a moment with a beginner's mind. What do I have to learn from this? But what that showed me in that moment is like, wow, there's so many other things to say to somebody that really are complimentary, without being even subtly offensive. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You just have to be willing to do that. And like you said, the willingness, the wantingness, the commitment, if you will. It's the same thing I talk about living a life committed to mindfulness, which is heightening your awareness. This is a day-to-day practice. This is something that we commit to and say we want to change it up. We want to be more thoughtful human beings on the planet. And if ever there was a time to do that, it's now. So let's talk about inclusion versus exclusion and what that actually looks like in everyday life. So our listeners can, I think we know what that means as a concept, but what does that look like in everyday life, the workplace and organizations? Help our listeners, Michael, know more about that.
Yeah, well, people know what it means vaguely, right? And we try to be very precise. So when we think about inclusion, for us, it means that someone feels welcomed, valued, respected, and heard, no matter who they are, right? They feel that. So we often say inclusion is not a spectator sport. It doesn't matter if in your head you're thinking, well, I value everyone. If they're not feeling it, it's not inclusion. So that means you have to do actively specific things to make people feel included. And so there are very specific things. They're often, pretty simple behaviors you can do. For example, if you're running a meeting at work, you can make sure everyone has a chance to talk if they want to talk, right? That's an inclusive practice. You can acknowledge someone's contribution to the conversation. That's an inclusive practice. You can ask follow-up questions to what they're saying. That makes people feel valued. Those are things that are really important to do. Exclusion, on the other hand, it can happen. It's usually not me saying, I don't like you, I don't like your idea, right? It's usually not that. It's often passive or subtle, the way that it happens.
Yes.
And yet, again, doesn't feel subtle to the person experiencing it. It actually feels, they do studies where they can do brain imaging and show that when someone feels exclusion, the same part of the brain lights up as the part that experiences physical pain, right? It feels terrible. And it gets in the way of all sorts of things. It gets in the way of our decision making, our problem solving. We might just think like, well, if I'm going to be excluded, I'm not giving my all to this job or to this relationship. I'll just get by maybe, or I'll look for a different place to work where I am going to be valued. So it feels terrible. And it also leads to some pretty bad consequences for people, for teams, for organizations, and for us in society.
Yeah. I consider myself an empath. And so I like the example of like when I'm in a social situation and let's say there's a group, even if it's a small group of 3, 4, 5 people, and we're talking and sometimes I've intuitively felt when one person is quiet and maybe they're not being addressed. They're not really being included in the conversation.
Right.
And what I have been cognizant of is how do I bring this person so that it's an inclusivity of the fact that we're all together, standing together, talking about this. Now, maybe they don't have anything to say in that moment in time, but at least you're taking the higher road, if you will, and saying, hey, Michael, what do you think about that? Do you know? And I think there's just so many little things that we can do. And again, this goes back to this mindful awareness of that I'm not just talking to this one person here. There's 3 other people here, do you know, who have the feelings and might be hurt by the fact, or maybe need us. If we could all be the bigger person and invite each other in, waiting, not waiting for someone else to do it for us, we would be more inclusive. Do you know? I mean, there's a lot we can do that I feel really is that mindful awareness of how can I include others in whatever situation or environment I'm in, because their voice matters, do you know? So you talk about, how microaggressions can actually take a toll on people's emotional well-being and physical health. And I would think that with young people, that's a big concern because, you have children, I have children, and it starts at a very, young level where, so this is something that kids should be learning. I've
Yeah.
taught mindfulness at schools where
Mhm.
children can really learn about how, because they're not maybe mature enough to understand that they're not including a friend, or how maybe they can triangulate and not include a friend, and how hurtful that is. I remember one time at one of my son's schools, there was a birthday party. It was just outrageous. And a parent invited every child in the class but one kid. It was just,
Ah,
it was so, and all of us moms really took affront with that, and we confronted the parent. I mean, a parent has a right to decide who to invite and not to invite to their child's birthday party, but leaving out one child just made no sense. And then there
yeah.
was a rule here out in California with some of the private schools that you just could not do that. You had to include everybody.
Mm.
So that's one of the ways in teaching kids that if you're going to have a birthday party, you need to include everybody. Do you know?
Yeah, the rules like that can be helpful because a lot of times we have unconscious biases that really impact the choices that we make and who we include and who we don't. We don't even realize it, but they're there and they're influencing how we engage, how we invite or include or exclude people. And that's really important. There's a study I always think about that makes this so clear to me. This was a Yale study where they took preschool teachers who were, supposedly very used to treating all the children the same. And they showed them a 10-minute video on a screen that had 4 children playing. It was a black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they said, watch for the problem behavior. There was no problem behavior in the video. But the real study was they tracked the teacher's eye movements. And they were watching the black boy almost the whole time because of these unconscious biases that they had,
Right,
that's where the problem behavior was going to be. And
right,
so it's no surprise then that we end up with disproportionate rates of detentions and expulsions and suspensions and all sorts of things. And
yeah,
that's there.
exactly,
And yet those teachers don't think they're doing that,
right,
right? But it runs so deep and is so tragic and impacts children from such a young age. And we've been talking a lot about race, but this is also about gender, sexuality, religion,
We're- yeah,
ability and disability, weight, physical appearance, age, generation. I mean, with my kids, I can see it where ever since they're young children, people will come up to my daughter and say, "Well, you're so gorgeous. The boys are going to go crazy for you." Or, asking my sons, like, "You have a girlfriend yet?" Um, and what they do in those moments is they're not necessarily trying to do it, but they're communicating heterosexuality is the norm. That's the expectation and the norm. And so when you have children who are transgender, who are not heterosexual, they're getting the messages loud and clear that they're
right,
not part of the norm. They're not valued in the same way. And
right,
that's tragic. And those subtle messages are everywhere. Like,
absolutely,
so one thing we have to do is in the moment think about how to be more inclusive right now, today, and we need to have a long-term vision for how to create children who have better ideas about what inclusion means and who's accepted, which should be everybody, right?
absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Again, this is a mindful awareness, and I think
Mhm,
this is going to take some learning and, again, commitment, because we can
mhm.
teach it, but if people aren't willing to really learn it or to recognize what it means to become more aware of these, subtle acts of, exclusion, we're going to be doing the same behaviors over and over
Mhm.
again. So let's
Right.
circle back again, Michael, if we could, to how organizational leaders can get more
Yeah.
on board for
Yeah.
being responsible to
Yeah.
keep people safe from psychological harm. Let's just say in the workplace, which you mentioned in the
Mhm,
book. I mean, the
mhm,
psychological harm can be anywhere and everywhere,
mhm.
but you talk about it in the workplace. So
Yeah.
let's talk a little
Yeah.
bit about that.
Yeah, so people have to create conditions for people to be safe expressing who they are, their creativity, their diversity, their innovation, all of that, right? And we know it's largely not happening now. Just in 2018, going back to LGBTQ plus issues, they did a study that LGBTQ folks, almost 50% of them were not open about their sexuality in the workplace in the United States, almost 50% in 2018. And does that mean people don't want to be open and comfortable with the people they work with? No. Or are they picking up on subtle cues that it's not safe to do that? Right. And so we need to put a lot of attention in that. So one way is by being proactively, consciously inclusive. And we do a lot of work with leadership on how to do that. Conscious inclusion. So making sure people are valued, creating that safety. And then another thing is creating that culture that I was talking about, where when subtle acts of exclusion happen, we can talk about them. And that means learning all the best practices for how this is going to go well or can go better, and actually practicing them. Leaders need to model what it looks like to speak out in support of their colleagues, right? If a woman's getting cut off in meetings, right, which we know happens, women get cut off in meetings way more than men, right? They do studies that can show this.
Right.
And so, yeah, women could speak up and say, hey, I feel like I'm getting cut off. But even more importantly, a man could say, hey, I feel like she's getting cut off, right? We can be allies for one another because inclusion is important for all of us. And so leaders can do that. If they see inclusion being threatened, they can do that too and model it in the good ways that it might work better. And so they need practice in how to do that effectively, and they need practice on how to recognize those things in the first place.
Right.
So often I'll say that to a group of people, that exact example about women getting cut off, and the men will say, they'll turn to the women and say, well, that doesn't happen here, right? And the women are like, are you kidding me? Like, are you kidding me? Yes, that happens here. So if it's not happening to you, you might not realize it. So you need to just learn deeply what other people experience who are different from you.
Yes, and to be open. And then again, if the organizational leaders are open to the way in which mindfulness is being implemented into the workplace, and more companies and leaders and CEOs and bosses are implementing that, I'd love to see this, so that a whole new way of understanding how not to exclude is something, we start to bring in these modalities into these environments. All it's going to do is it's going to heighten our awareness so that we can just be more conscious human beings on the planet. Much needed right now. Okay.
Yeah.
So talk to our listeners a little bit about connecting to your own marginalized identities and what
Mhm.
that looks like. Because I know you go into the book, like some people might not feel that they know even what their marginalized identities are. Do you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about diversity, it means all of these different dimensions of diversity. It's not just race, gender, age, right? But it might be ability or disability, right? Some disabilities are totally non-apparent. It might be something you're not open with people about, but maybe you suffer from depression, for example. It might be physical appearance. It might be religion. In my case, I mentioned that I am white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, don't experience subtle acts of exclusion along those dimensions. But I'm also Jewish, and growing up Jewish in an area that was not predominantly Jewish meant that you definitely feel subtle acts of exclusion along that dimension, especially around like big holidays where you feel like this is not for me. Like the way this culture's set up is not for me. And you feel that. So you can connect with any part of your diverse identity that might have felt that kind of exclusion. And hopefully that opens the door for you to really hear and listen to what other people experience as well. For real. It's hard. it's hard to really listen to people from their perspective because we filter
Absolutely.
everything
I
through
know.
our own experiences.
Absolutely. And I think all of us can remember growing up when we experienced those feelings. I know I did too, growing up, white, female, Jewish,
Mhm.
and remembering, I mean, I think everybody could probably just talk about remembering the first time they felt that, based on whatever their feelings of marginalization was at that moment in time.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, be it religion, race, all the things that you mentioned in the book.
Hmm.
Let's talk about a little bit, if you could, to walk our listeners through maybe a scenario of subtle acts of exclusion and what role someone might play in it, which you call in the book subject, initiator, observer, ally, and bystander. And I know
Hmm.
that to get a more solid overview of that, people would have to really read that in the book. But maybe you can give us just a little taste of that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, for example, there's an example, I can't remember if it's in the book, but in a lot of workplace meetings, large meetings, they'll have a microphone, right? So a microphone that's supposed to go around, you pass from person to person so that everyone making a comment or question is using the microphone. That's a good inclusive practice because it helps everyone hear. We don't know who might have a hard time hearing. And so that helps everyone to hear. And yet, when you do that, you'll often get people thinking like, well, I'm uncomfortable with the microphone. I don't like it. And so they might just try to not use it. They might say, I'm loud enough without that thing. Or, might make a joke like, hello, Cleveland, I'll be here all week, or something like that. Right. So what that's communicating to people who actually need that microphone to be used to hear is you're a burden. You're not normal. You're not valued, right? That's what that's communicating. It's not meant to, right? But that's what it's communicating. And so you might be able to say to someone who makes that joke with the microphone, hey, I know you didn't mean anything bad by that at all. Microphones make a lot of people uncomfortable. Um, just wondering if we can talk about that a little bit as a group, because it might make someone who has a hard time hearing feel bad. It might make them feel not included, or like they're not, like they're a burden for us or something. So can we talk about how that happens? So that's how you might do what we call calling someone in rather than calling someone out, right? Which might feel good, but not be very productive. And
Mhm.
here you're doing that as an ally, right? If you're the one saying that and you don't have a problem hearing, you're doing that as an ally, not as the person who's experiencing the subtle act of exclusion. Now, if you're the person who made that joke with the microphone, you have a huge responsibility to take that feedback well, to not get defend. You're going to want to probably defend your intention. No, it's just that, right? I just meant that. You're going to want to do that so badly because you don't want to be thought of as a bad person, right? And so it's so important for you to put those feelings away and focus on the impact on the other person, right? To really hear it, to really listen, to follow up, to engage with it. Those moments where people are vulnerable and share with you their a subtle act of exclusion that they experience or that they think someone else might experience. What a gift it is that they're giving us. We, as you talked about, we all want to be better people, or most of us want to be better people.
Yes.
We want to be better
And
people.
more people are also getting on board for that.
Yes. And yet, um, that's a moment where something maybe unconscious that we're doing, or subtle or unintended, is making people feel bad. What a gift that someone risked their own comfort to share that with us. And we need to have that attitude. What a gift I've been given. If I take it and take it seriously, I'll build trust and I'll build connection. If I don't take it seriously, I'll just build a barrier, right?
Right, right. Yeah. I want to circle back a little bit because I know that you have so many wonderful, the book is broken down into subtle acts of exclusion in so many areas, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, etc. But I'm seeing so much, and on the heels of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protesting and all that, and that there's a lot of difference of opinion around people saying, I don't see color. I know this is a loaded subject right now, and then others say that's BS, and many people in interracial marriages have said that love sees no color or race, and this is a very hot topic right now, and I'm seeing a lot of polarization around it, if you will. So how do you take something like that, where people either feel very strongly on one side of that or the other, where we can apply the subtle acts of exclusion to something that, again, is, we got a lot of hot topics going on right now. We really do. And how do we plug this into that? That's where I want to go a little bit, because, ultimately we want to be able to take these tools and we want to, and these skill sets that make us more conscious human beings, and plug them into where the areas of which they are needed the most.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, first, that example you gave, that's pretty common, right? I don't see color, or I don't even see you as Black, or something like that. Like if someone's saying that, and someone else, right, is hearing it and saying, well, if you don't see me as Black, you're not seeing me. If you don't see color, you're not seeing something that's really central to my identity. And so I get it, maybe, that you're trying to convey that you value everyone, that you don't see a difference in potential based on someone's color or race. I get that. But you inadvertently are communicating to me that I'm invisible, I don't matter, right? And so I am Black, and I would love for you to see me that way, right? So a way of calling someone in. And then it's, like I mentioned before, it's a huge responsibility on the other person to not defend themselves, to just say,
Right.
oh, to hear that, to take it in, say, oh, yeah, I get that. I'll do things differently. I get that. That makes sense, right?
Right.
And to realize that you can't filter that through your own experience. So many times people think, well, I wouldn't have thought that. Well, that wouldn't have mattered to me. Well, that wouldn't have gotten me upset. You're not the other person.
Right. And if you're someone who's not in an interracial marriage and you don't see your partner by the color of their skin, that's their experience. It might not be your experience. Do you know what I mean? The way in which we don't really just assume that everybody should be having the same way in which we see one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, there is not a child growing up in the United States that is free from understanding that there are differences based on race and ethnicity in this country, that those groups exist, that they are valued differently. It might be unconscious, but it's there in your brain. Our brains are picking that information out from the world at a very young age. And you don't have to be taught explicitly about bias and racism. Your brain seeks out that information, just like you don't need to be taught to speak a language. Your brain does it. All you got to do is talk to a child and they will learn language. Reading's a different story.
Sponges. They're sponges.
They're not even sponges, right? Sponge makes it seem passive. They've got like tentacles. Their brains are reaching out into the world to pick up that information.
Absolutely, without a doubt. Another hot topic right now is privilege. And in your chapter, Ability, SAE, you say that privilege is real and not relegated to any single class, gender, or other demographic. Tell us more about what you mean by that. Because privilege, again, that's a hot topic right now, and you can go in many different directions.
Yeah. So often when people hear that, when people hear especially white privilege, for example, it lands like it's not effective. People hear that and think what is being said is that you got everything handed to you, that life is easy. And we know for the vast majority of people, things are getting harder economically, right? So I'll often start talks with like, you probably don't feel like everything's being handed to you. You probably don't feel like life is easy, right? It's harder and harder to pay your rent, your mortgage, to pay your medical bills. Like, forget about cable TV. Like, things are hard, right? Now imagine that on average, white families have 13 times more wealth than Black families, right? Now, imagine how hard it is for you and people you know. Now think about that. And people, that's usually pretty eye-opening for people, like, oh, then we can start to talk about why that might be. And we can get into systemic things, systemic inequalities. And that can be so helpful as a way to just start the conversation, right? I mean, there are people who do the work that I do, who think that, the way to get to reach someone is to hit them with the hardest stuff first, right? White privilege, white supremacy, white fragility, all of that. And it sounds good and it feels good to say. As someone who's studied communication a lot, I don't know if it's the most effective. And to me, it's all about how effective it can be. I heard an interview with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi recently, where he was saying the radicalness of an idea should be judged not by how good it feels to say it or how radical it sounds to you, but how much it changes somebody's thinking, right? And
that's great. That's a great quote, actually. Very effective.
It really resonates, and it's how we approach this. That our idea is that if you make someone defensive, they just tend to dig their heels in and not have a growth mindset.
Totally. And you actually can have a backlash to that, which the very thing you're trying to achieve might not be realized because of the level of feeling that maybe people take a position that these things need to be said, and they do need to be said blatantly, or there's a type of perception of radicalization of the way in which it's being said. But we also have to be mindful of how are people going to receive that information. And as you said, digging their heels in, it might work in the opposite way.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to be clear that it doesn't mean coddling and it doesn't mean sugarcoating. It means holding people accountable, right? It's a communication style, and still talking about all of the topics and the very hard topics, and still talking about inequalities and disparities and violence and racism, still talking about all that and building in accountability, but just trying hard to get people there so that they can really get invested in it. It's so important. We need people invested in it.
Absolutely. Look, not again, this sugarcoating thing, these are really important issues, sensitive or not, that we need to talk about, whether we like it or not. Do you know? So I think it's incumbent upon us to figure out how best can we do that with one another. This has to be talked about. These things that are being presented to us today can seem very can be very uncomfortable for people. So as you said, many people might want to say, you know what, this is just too much. This is just getting out of control here. Do you know? So we don't want to see escapism from that. Yeah. We want to see us go towards that which is uncomfortable for us. That's the only way change can happen. Absolutely. So another area that you talk about in the book with SAE is religion. And according to the Encyclopedia of Wars, out of all 1,763 known recorded historical conflicts, little statistic here, 123 or 6.98% had religion as their primary cause. So I would imagine that subtle acts of exclusion around religion can turn really violent really fast for it to escalate into war. And we know where that's gone historically. So something like just the way in which we handle religion and the differences of them with one another. I mean, if we haven't learned from the historical nightmares that we witnessed, what are we going to learn? Do you know what I mean? You're talking about new areas that I think that are very current to the changes that we're experiencing right now. But we also have these areas that we've known historically have not served us well, religion being one of them. So you take a concept like SAE, plug that into religious differences. Wow. Do you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's intense, and there for religions that aren't the dominant religion of a place, it can be very challenging depending on, the place and the religion and the type of biases that exist, exclusion that exists, violence that exists. It can be really intense. And and then some of it is very, you can't get more explicit than war, right? Genocide. And then some of it is different. Some of it is subtle, right? Where people are still trying to do good, but still excluding people.
But there's a lot of, learned behavior, and there's a lot of, repetition of this learned behavior from generations prior. And I actually feel very hopeful about the new generation. I think that they can really change things up dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about, age and generation SAE, and that, the question specifically to the hopefulness of for the new generations to learn really how to implement subtle acts of exclusion, and how to be responsible and accountable for that, because they're the ones they're the generations that are moving into the future here. And I see we only have a couple of minutes, and then I have one more other question too.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I am hopeful. I think there's some incredible young people out there, and yet for so long, I think people have had this idea that things will just get better as time marches on. Older generations will die, and young people, look at how their social groups are all diverse. We're gonna be fine. And that is worrisome to me, because I've seen research showing that even if friend groups are diverse, a lot of younger generations still have some of the same unconscious biases as older generations. And so I worry that it lets us all as a society off the hook by thinking, well, we just wait and it'll get better. And I want us to be very clear, we cannot wait. We have to actively create the society that we want, the world that we want, by looking at policies, procedures, practices, all of that, unconscious biases and messages that children hear, subtle acts of exclusion, and leaning into hard conversations. We have to do it all in a whole new way.
I agree. And in as much as I am hopeful that the generations coming up will know that they want to create solutions rather than to keep perpetuating a lot of the problems they feel they inherited by the generations before them, okay? But that there is accountability and responsibility that needs to be taken right now. I totally agree with you. So Michael, let's end with intentional acts of inclusion. Leave our listeners, if you will, with a few insights about what can they do and where can they go from here as far as making new choices for themselves and behaving more intentionally and inclusively.
Yeah, great. So intentional acts of inclusion, the whole idea is subtle acts of exclusion can make people feel you don't belong, you're inadequate, you're a burden, you're a threat, all of these terrible things. And the idea is that by doing intentional acts of inclusion, we can make people feel you're welcomed, you're included, you're valued, you do belong, you're seen and heard as an individual, which would be amazing, right? And so proactively, things we can do, and recognizing that it's not going to be quick. This is something that we have to commit to for our entire lives. Learning, listening, and supporting those people who are around us, and really working towards a paradigm shift in the way that we include everyone. It's the most important thing happening right now. And I want people to feel empowered, that it feels like a lot, and it is a lot, but there are people out there that study this, that figure out how to create policies that have more equity, that figure out how to reduce unconscious biases, that talk about how to have these difficult conversations. We actually can be more intentional and make a bigger difference. And so I want people to feel empowered by that.
Absolutely. So Michael, thank you so much for being my guest today. I really enjoyed this conversation, very illuminating. Please tell our listeners how they can find out more about you.
Yeah, thanks, Ora. Yeah, so you can find out more information about me and the work that I'm doing at inQuestconsulting.com. There's information about the book at subtleactsofexclusion.com. You can connect with me all over social media. Love that engagement. And same with my co-author, Tiffany Jana, Jana.
Wonderful. So listeners, thank you so much for being here with Michael Baran and I today. I highly recommend getting Michael Baran and Tiffany Jana's book, Subtle Acts of Inclusion, How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions, and to give more thought to what new choices you're going to implement today, start today, to make more intentionally and inclusively decisions towards others. So until we meet again, from my heart to yours, stay safe, stay present, and stay kind.